In the humid summer of 1847, within their Garden District mansion in New Orleans, 13 members of the prominent Bogard family died within hours of each other. Deep in the Louisiana State Archives, the official records list the cause as sudden fever, but a different story is told by the hastily scribbled notes in the margins. In his private journal, the attending physician, Dr. Armand Thibodeau, wrote that he had never witnessed such synchronized agony, adding that the symptoms bore no resemblance to any known disease. Their tongues swollen purple, the victims' fingernails had turned black, and until dawn, their final screams echoed through the mansion's halls. Even more disturbing is that every single death occurred exactly 90 minutes after the family's traditional Sunday supper. And the only person in the house who survived was Violet, the head cook in the kitchen. For over a century and 70 years, hidden behind a wall of shame, fear, and deliberate silence, this tragedy has remained one of New Orleans' most carefully guarded secrets. But tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about what really happened in that kitchen and why an entire bloodline vanished in a single evening. Before we continue with the story of Violet and the Bogard massacre, make sure you're subscribed to our channel because diving deep into America's darkest forgotten histories is exactly why we tell stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and in the comments, let us know what state you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from across the country. The truth about that fatal Sunday supper began years before the first drop of poison touched aristocratic lips, rooted in a cycle of cruelty that would eventually demand its due. A city of stark contrasts was New Orleans in 1847, where magnificent mansions rose like monuments to wealth while human bondage formed the foundation of that prosperity. The city's elite, sugar plantation owners, cotton merchants, and shipping magnates who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor, housed themselves in the Garden District, where Spanish moss draped over wrought iron balconies like funeral shrouds. One of the district's crown jewels was the Bogard Mansion, a 3-story Greek Revival masterpiece with towering Corinthian columns that seemed to scrape the Louisiana sky. From his father, Octave Bogard had inherited both the house and the family's vast sugar plantation, along with a reputation for being what polite society called a strict disciplinarian and what his slaves knew as something far more sinister. With the same iron fist he used to rule his plantation, Octave, at 43, commanded his household. A delicate woman from a prominent Creole family, his wife Celeste had long ago learned to turn a blind eye to her husband's cruelties in exchange for maintaining her position in society. Their 4 children, Etienne, 19, Margot, 17, Philippe, 15, and little Amélie, just 8, had been raised to view the enslaved people around them as property, no different from the fine china or silver candlesticks that adorned their dining room. Not just the immediate family lived in the mansion, but also Octave's younger brother, Auguste, and his wife, Lucille, with their twin sons, Henri and Louis, both 14. While Lucille fancied herself a patron of the arts, hosting elaborate salons for New Orleans' cultural elite, Auguste served as overseer of the plantation's business affairs in the city. Completing the household were Octave's elderly mother, Grandmère Bogard, who at 78 still wielded considerable influence over family decisions, and Celeste's spinster sister, Tante Felicite, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes missed nothing that transpired within the mansion's walls. In this world of privilege and power lived 26 enslaved souls, each bearing the invisible scars of their bondage. But heavier scars than anyone were borne by Violet. The daughter of Essie, the previous head cook, Violet had been born in the mansion's slave quarters in 1823. When Violet was barely 14, her mother died of exhaustion. From that tender age, Violet had been thrust into the role of feeding the very family that owned her body and soul. An almost supernatural skill in the kitchen was possessed by her. Her hand seemed to know exactly how much spice to add, how long to let the roux darken, and which herbs would transform simple ingredients into culinary masterpieces that earned the Bogards praise throughout New Orleans society. But a price that few in the house understood came with Violet's talents. She worked 18 hours a day, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and collapsing long after midnight once the last dish had been cleaned. Nothing but a straw mattress, a single change of clothes, and a small wooden cross that had belonged to her mother were contained in her small, windowless room in the servants' quarters. Her unique position in the household hierarchy made Violet's situation even more unbearable. As head cook, she was expected to maintain the family's reputation for hosting the finest dinners in the district. Yet, she was forbidden from tasting the very food she prepared. By sight alone, she knew the texture of every sauce, by smell, the doneness of every roast, and by intuition alone, the sweetness of every dessert. This cruel irony wasn't lost on Octave, who took perverse pleasure in reminding her that while she created food fit for kings, she would eat nothing but scraps for the rest of her life. A mixture of respect and pity was how the other enslaved people in the household looked to Violet. They respected her skills and the small privileges her position afforded. She was rarely whipped, never sent to work in the cane fields, and sometimes received cast-off dresses from the ladies of the house. But they also pitied her isolation, for her demanding schedule left little time for the friendships and small moments of joy that made their harsh existence bearable. Among the household staff was Samuel, the stable master's son, who at 28 had caught Violet's eye despite the dangers such attraction could bring. Across the courtyard, their stolen glances and whispered conversations in the kitchen after midnight had blossomed into something deeper. Though both knew that love was a luxury slaves could rarely afford. Samuel dreamed of somehow purchasing their freedom and starting a life together in the free territories, but on a plantation where a strong field hand might earn his master $50 a year in profit. Such dreams seemed as distant as the stars. There was also old Moses, the butler who had served the family for over 40 years and whose bent back and graying hair told the story of decades spent bowing to Bogart demands. An almost supernatural ability to anticipate the family's needs had been developed by Moses, appearing with wine before it was requested and knowing exactly when to make himself invisible during their more private conversations. His loyalty to the family was legendary among New Orleans society, though those who looked closely might have noticed the cold fire that burned in his ancient eyes. Young Lily, barely 16, worked as a lady's maid to Celeste and her daughters. Her beauty had not gone unnoticed by the men of the house, and she lived in constant fear of the attention such notice might bring. Like a ghost, she moved through the mansion, trying to remain invisible while performing her duties with the perfection expected of her. In the stables worked Thomas, Samuel's father, whose knowledge of horses was matched only by his understanding of how to survive in a world designed to break him. 3 masters had been outlived by Thomas, and 2 wives had been buried by him, learning long ago that the key to survival was never letting your true thoughts show on your face. A precise schedule that had been established over decades was followed by the mansion's daily routine. At 7 sharp, breakfast was served with the family gathering in the morning room overlooking the garden. At 1 o'clock, luncheon occurred, often featuring guests from New Orleans society who came to discuss business or social matters. But the crown jewel of the week's dining was represented by the Sunday supper. Every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, the entire extended family would gather in the grand dining room beneath the crystal chandelier that had been imported from Paris at tremendous expense. Set with the finest china, sterling silver, and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars would be the table, which could seat 20. Sacred to the Bogarts were these Sunday suppers, a time when business was set aside and family bonds were celebrated and strengthened. For Violet, the culmination of her weekly efforts was represented by Sunday suppers. She would begin preparing on Friday, selecting the finest ingredients from the French market, planning a menu that would showcase her skills while honoring the family's Creole heritage. The meal typically consisted of 7 courses, a light soup, fish prepared with delicate sauces, fowl seasoned with exotic spices, multiple vegetable dishes featuring whatever was freshest from the garden, elaborate meat courses that demonstrated both her skill and the family's wealth, and finally, desserts that were works of art as much as food. As predictable as the sunrise was the family's Sunday ritual. They would gather in the parlor at 5:30 for cocktails, the men enjoying imported brandy while the ladies sipped delicate cordials. Conversation would flow over topics ranging from plantation business to New Orleans gossip, with the children expected to listen respectfully to their elders. At precisely 6 o'clock, old Moses would announce that supper was served, and with the ceremony of a religious procession, the family would process into the dining room. Octave always sat at the head of the table with Celeste at the opposite end. According to a hierarchy that had been established years ago and never varied, the children and extended family members took their assigned seats. Despite her advanced age, Grandmere Bogart maintained her position of honor at Octave's right hand, while August sat to his left. Carefully orchestrated was the conversation during these meals, with each family member understanding their role in maintaining the image of harmonious prosperity. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed domestic tranquility, tension simmered like a pot ready to boil over. Unusual stress had been brought to the Bogard household by the spring of 1847. The previous year, the sugar crop had been poor due to flooding, and creditors were beginning to make uncomfortable inquiries about outstanding debts. Several pieces of property had been forced to be sold by Octave, and he was considering the unthinkable option of selling some of his slaves to raise capital. Even more volatile than usual had these financial pressures made Octave. His temper, which had never been pleasant, had become explosive and unpredictable. The warning signs were learned by the enslaved people of the household: the way his jaw would clench when reviewing ledgers, the sharp tone he would use when giving orders, and most dangerously, the way his eyes would grow cold and calculating when he was planning some new cruelty. It was during this period of mounting tension that Violet's relationship with Samuel began to deepen into something that could no longer be hidden or ignored. The catalyst for the tragedy that would unfold came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late June 1847, when the Louisiana heat seemed to press down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. In the kitchen preparing for a dinner party the Bogards were hosting for visiting Charleston plantation owners, Violet was carefully arranging canapés when she heard Samuel's voice from the courtyard raised in what sounded like distress. To the kitchen window she rushed and saw a scene that would forever change the course of her life. On his knees in the dusty courtyard was Samuel, his shirt torn and bloody, while Octave stood over him with a leather whip in his hand. With rage was the master's face twisted, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed accusations. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes?" Clearly through the humid air, Octave's voice carried. "You forget your place, boy." To ice turned Violet's blood as she realized what had happened. Recently, Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been spending more time in the stables, and Violet had noticed the way the girl's cheeks would flush whenever Samuel was nearby. She had also seen Samuel's discomfort at this unwanted attention, his careful attempts to avoid being alone with any of the white women in the household. But in the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was interpreted as presumption, and presumption was a crime punishable by death. "Please, Master Bogard," between blows, Samuel gasped. "I would never." "Silence." Again, Octave's whip cracked, leaving another bloody stripe across Samuel's back. "Your silence is guilt enough." But what happened next was what sealed everyone's fate. As Octave raised his arm for another blow, Violet couldn't contain herself any longer. Between the whip and Samuel's bleeding back, she burst from the kitchen door and threw herself. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "Samuel done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard." In her throat, the words died as Octave's face turned toward her, his expression shifting from rage to something far more dangerous: cold, calculating fury. Into the shadows, the other slaves in the courtyard seemed to shrink back, sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "So," Octave said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his previous shouting. "The cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." Violet's knees began to shake, but she didn't move from her position, shielding Samuel. "No, Master. You just what?" Closer stepped Octave, so close she could smell the brandy on his breath and see the network of broken blood vessels in his eyes. "You just think you can interfere with your betters? You think because you can cook a decent meal, you have the right to question my judgment?" The sound of Samuel's labored breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird from somewhere in the garden broke the silence that followed. A line from which there was no return had been crossed by Violet, she knew. But as she looked down at Samuel's bleeding form, she realized she didn't care. "Samuel is a good man," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Like the sound of breaking glass was Octave's laugh. "A good man? His property, girl. My property. And so are you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've gotten ideas above your station." A punishment that went far beyond physical pain was what followed. Octave ordered Samuel to be locked in the stable's tack room with no food or water, declaring that he would remain there until he learned proper respect. But for Violet, he devised something far more cruel. From now on, he announced to the assembled household, Violet will prepare all meals as usual, but she will not eat until every member of this family has declared themselves satisfied with her work, and since I am very difficult to satisfy. Like smoke from a funeral pyre, he let the threat hang in the air. A nightmare beyond description were the next 3 days. While subsisting on nothing but water and the occasional scrap that old Moses or Lily could sneak to her when no one was watching, Violet continued to prepare elaborate meals for the family. Her hands shook as she kneaded bread, her vision blurred as she stirred sauces, and her legs could barely support her weight as she carried heavy platters to the dining room. But worse than her physical suffering was the psychological torture Octave inflicted. He would find fault with every dish: the soup was too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables overcooked, and each criticism meant another day without food. While she stood in the corner of the dining room, forced to watch him eat the food she had prepared but could not taste, he took visible pleasure in describing the flavors and textures of each dish. On the second day of her punishment, driven by desperation and concern for Violet, Samuel managed to escape from the tack room. He made it as far as the kitchen before Octave's men caught him. Savage enough that Dr. Thibodeau had to be called to ensure Samuel wouldn't die before Octave was finished with him was the beating that followed. It was while tending to Samuel's wounds that Dr. Thibodeau made an observation that would prove crucial to understanding what followed. As he cleaned Samuel's injuries, he noticed that Violet was hovering nearby, her face gaunt from hunger, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. That girl, he told his wife later that evening, has the look of someone who has been pushed past the breaking point. I've seen it before in slaves who have been driven too far. It's a dangerous look. A man who understood the delicate balance that held plantation society together was Dr. Thibodeau. Born into a family of modest means, he had worked his way up to become one of New Orleans' most respected physicians, serving both the wealthy plantation families and, when his conscience demanded it, providing secret medical care to slaves whose masters would rather let them die than pay for treatment. Enough cruelty over the years had been seen by him to understand its effects on the human soul. He knew that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply break. They would become hollow shells, going through the motions of life without really living. But some, a dangerous few, would transform their suffering into something harder and more focused. These were the ones who would smile while planning revenge, who would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. As he looked at Violet that day, tending to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling with exhaustion but were instead steady with purpose, Dr. Thibodeau recognized the signs. A mental note was made by him to warn Octave that his cruelty was creating a dangerous situation. But like many such good intentions, it was something he kept meaning to do until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet died, and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room watching Octave savor a piece of her famous praline bread pudding, describing its flavors with theatrical enthusiasm while she swayed on her feet from hunger, a cold clarity settled over her mind like fog rolling in from the Mississippi. Things she had never paid attention to before, she began to notice. The way Octave's hand shook slightly when he was nervous, indicating that his financial troubles were worse than the family let on, the way Celeste's eyes would dart to the brandy decanter when she thought no one was looking, suggesting that the lady of the house was developing a dependency on alcohol to cope with her life, the way young Philippe would steal glances at Lily when he thought his parents weren't watching, a look that made Violet's stomach turn with its implications. But most importantly, she began to pay attention to the family's routines, their preferences, their habits. She noticed that Grandmere Bogard always took her medicine exactly 30 minutes before meals. She observed that Auguste had a nervous habit of checking his pocket watch precisely every 15 minutes during dinner. She saw that little Amélie always ate her vegetables first, saving her favorite parts of the meal for last. These observations, which had once been simply part of her job as a cook, now took on a different significance. She began to see the family not as her oppressors, but as a puzzle to be solved, a problem that required the right solution. It was on that third night, as she finally collapsed on her straw mattress after Octave had grudgingly declared himself marginally satisfied with her evening meal, that Violet made the decision that would seal all their fates. She would continue to serve the Bogard family with the same skill and dedication she had always shown, but she would serve them in a way they would never forget. Not born of sudden rage or desperate impulse was the plan that began to form in her mind. It was crafted with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to her finest meals, seasoned with the patient wisdom she had learned from years of observing the family's habits and preferences. She would wait for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, she would serve the Bogart family a meal they would remember for eternity.